Good morning. We're going to continue our discussion on the Republic. We're going to pick up where we left off last time. We're going to consider some of the other features that Socrates constructs inside his city in speech, look at some of the constituent elements, and then we're going to consider at the end of the class, or in the second part of today's class, the implications of this text, that Plato's Republic serves as a historicist blueprint for totalitarianism, which was the famous thesis laid out by Popper in his text, The Open Society, published in the 1940s. Okay, so last time that we were together, we looked at the way in which Socrates constructs this city, a city out of speech, as he says, a thought experiment, constructing a city in order to answer this question of what is justice, which we explored. And we saw that as part of this thought experiment, the first city that he constructs, and I'll reiterate it because it's going to be important later on, the first city he constructs is an autarkic city. The idea of autarky being self-sufficiency. Glaucon intervenes and accuses him of having constructed what he calls a city of pigs, meaning a city that barely rises or only rises to cover the bare necessities. And there are no other additional elements in this first city that Socrates constructs. This is not, in other words, a realistic city. This is not how people live. And so they proceed to construct what Socrates calls a luxurious city, which he then also describes as an inflamed and swollen, or we might say a feverish city. We move then from this first construct, a city that is essentially founded upon the principle of autarky, to a city that includes surplus resources that can be deployed. And the reason that matters is because it is a city that has things that go beyond the basic necessities, therefore there is the need to defend what the city is able to accumulate for itself. And that means that the city needs to have provisions for its defense. Because, therefore, it needs to have provisions for its defense, this then spurs all of the subsequent discussion, because you may recall that the entire issue of the guardians, this special class of people who are charged essentially with the safekeeping and well-being of the city, that the very need for the guardians comes out of the fact that they've moved from this first autarkic city into the luxurious city. That creates the basis then for the guardians. And indeed, he calls the guardians the most important element in the city because they are the ones who then can defend it. This city of surplus, this city of goods and so on, this is what Socrates argues is the origins of war. That one person has something, another person wants it, and therefore there's the potential for conflict. To protect yourself, therefore you need to have this guardian class. And we saw last time that the guardian class is constructed in such a way as to represent a kind of higher class or upper class of people inside the city. We looked at some of the elements then that Socrates lays out as part of the just city. Remember that this is about an experiment in defining or constructing what is a just city. And we saw some of those elements, and I think they strike the modern ear as somewhat jarring. For instance, we saw that there is a full-throated defense of what we would call today censorship. That is to say that the rulers of the city are given the right essentially to determine what people should hear, what messages are correct and what messages are dangerous, to make that decision and then to adjust the flow of information accordingly. We also saw that the leaders arrogated for themselves the ability to essentially dissimulate to the population, to lie to the population, the so-called noble lie, which we saw outlined at sections 389b and 389c. The idea being that those who are ruling the city will, from time to time, find it expedient to simply not tell the truth to the people in the city, and they need to have that power. And we further saw then that based on that power to lie, that the city constituted in this way of essentially three groups of people: the guardians who defend the city, the auxiliaries who essentially serve that class, and then everybody else, the agricultural workers, the craftsmen, and so on, that in order to explain why the city is divided in this sort of tripartite way, this sort of division of three, that the founders of the city decide that the people need to be told one of these noble lies. They need to be told that the reason that the city is divided in this way is because, you may recall the somewhat fanciful description, that they've been buried in the ground, fashioned by the gods, and the gods have chosen to make some of gold, some of silver, and yet others of bronze and iron. And so depending on which admixture you have, more gold, more silver, more bronze, more iron, this then defines the class that you are in. So essentially it's a way of locking people into a kind of class-based social system. But we also noted in that discussion of class that one of the features of it that's quite unusual is that as part of this noble lie, part of the sort of dissimulation about why they are in the class that they are in, is that they leave the possibility that for the future, that is for the children of anybody, that the class of the children may not mirror the class of the parents. So the children of those made of bronze or iron may give birth to children who are of gold. Those who are children of gold parents may themselves be silver or bronze or iron. In other words, there's an element of social mobility or mixture or movement inside this kind of social system, so that you are not locked perpetually, you and all of your progeny are not locked perpetually into this rigid system of class. And so we saw that those are the kinds of elements that he introduces as sort of part of the well-run city. And the idea then is that power is entrusted into this special class. You may recall that since we've imbued the ruling authority with all of these special abilities, namely the ability to censor, so the ability to decide what you hear, the stories that you were told, to shape, as it were, the world around you, the ability to decide when you are told the truth and when you are not, the ability to define people according to their class, that essentially then this creates a need for this highly specialized class of rulers. And so further to that then, Socrates elaborates where this ruling class comes from. And he argues that they are a subset of the guardian class, those who have the best characteristics of the guardian class, which remember have the best characteristics of people overall, wisdom, strength, energy. And so those who have all of those to the greatest degree, and most importantly wisdom, they then ascend to this position of authority. And this then leads to this famous idea that the just city, the best run city, is a city run by the philosopher king. Those who are the lovers of wisdom should take over the city. And essentially what we can say then is if you have a great deal of confidence that your political system is constantly or consistently selecting for certain traits, certain characteristics in those who then are allowed to exercise authority, allowed to exercise rule, that these are the kinds of powers one would be comfortable to hand out. Much as a child respects the wisdom of their parents, it's essentially that kind of a relationship. So if you have confidence, in other words, that the ruling class does represent this kind of wisdom, then in fact some of these things become much less problematic. They will lie to you not because they are evil or they are greedy or they are self-seeking. They will lie to you because they have the wisdom to know what is in everybody's best interest. And similarly that applies to censorship. It's not simply that they are distorting the truth in order to serve their own goals. The point is that you can trust them to distort the truth, to censor as needed in order to essentially serve the larger social good, the larger public good. When you introduce these kinds of elements, it puts a great deal of emphasis then on the nature of who shall lead. And so that's why for the entire exercise inside the Republic, the emphasis then on this special class of guardians and then a sort of further elite subclass who have this singular capacity. There are elements of this ideal city linked to this need to construct this special guardian class that take us into places that are really quite extraordinary with respect to how we would have a kind of modern understanding of social norms. And that is we'll consider two. Three maybe. One is the feminism that is embedded in the city. The second is the communism that's embedded in the city. And the third is the radical redrawing of familial ties that we find linked to this discussion of the city. We'll start with the question of the role of women inside the Republic. This has captured a lot of attention, not least because, of course, as we've already seen when Plato was writing this text by convention in ancient Greece, the role of women was extremely subordinated to that of men. Women were not allowed to be citizens. Their rights as property holders was constrained. They were not public figures. They were very much private figures embedded inside the family unit, and frankly, in many cases, simply treated as property used via marriage to transfer wealth between one family and another. One thing that we do not see in sort of the Greek social context is much sense of the female body as a public individual. If you know your Greek theater, maybe you've read Antigone, there are certainly female characters, we do see female roles, but you'll recall that almost always in ancient Greek, theatrical presentation, the female body is always the body of the mother, right? It's the body of the family, the woman who's expressing sort of concern for her children. In fact, you may remember that the great tragedy of Antigone is not a public tragedy. It is not a tragedy of war or tragedy of public policy, a tragedy of the state. It is a personal tragedy that she cannot bury her children, that is the role of the mother to sort of nurture, take care of, supervise her children. The typical female role in this society is inside, embedded within the family. And we saw that idea, that prejudice, if you will, reinforced in the Apology, which I've drawn your attention to, and in part I drew your attention to it to contrast it with the discussion we find in the Republic, when Socrates tells his Athenian accusers that were a foreigner to come to Athens, they would find a city as if run by women, as being a sort of prime insult. That in other words, those who have no capacity for a public role have now taken on a public role. That is the sort of disgrace that he attributes to the Athenian polity in putting him on trial. So all this to say, therefore, that the kind of language, the kind of ideas that Socrates presents to us with respect to the role of women inside his model republic is really quite striking. Let's take a look then at some of the things that he says. He discusses the role of feminism at section 451E. And the idea is that within the guardian class, what should be the distinction between men and women? Now, it is acknowledged at the outset amongst the speakers, basically three men deciding what women are like. Not much changes over time. Anyway, so these three men deciding who are women, all acknowledge that women are weaker than men. So essentially, if you will, the fundamental premise of the long-standing prejudice against the female body, namely that they are a weaker version of the male body, still is operative inside the social language of the Republic. He says that we treat the females as weaker and the males as stronger. But the question is, from the point of view of the guardians, and they use, as often found in the text, a kind of animal analogy, if you have horses and one horse is stronger than another horse, does it mean that neither are capable of working in the fields or pulling the plow or pulling the cart and so on? And the answer is that, in fact, the capacity is not solely a question then of strength. And on the basis of this sort of analogy, they conclude that we may employ women for the same tasks as men. Inside this kind of guardian class, that women can demonstrate the same excellences as men, the excellences of wisdom, of strength, of energy, of courage, and therefore they may also be employed as guardians. And this is the kind of key insight, because, as he notes, as he follows, if we are going to employ women in the same capacity as men, therefore those women must be trained, right, must be shaped, must be formed in the same way. As he says, we must give them the same teaching. So we do not then discriminate between the kinds of ways that we train male guardians, the ways that we treat female guardians. As he says, is it not true that the human female is naturally capable of sharing all the activities of the male? And they ask, which can she engage in, which can she not? Is she capable of all of them? Is she capable of some of them? Is she capable of some but not others? If so, in which class should we consider, for example, military activity, etc.? Where should we think that women may serve in this kind of guardian capacity? And so from there, we essentially see that women take on, although it's not exactly an equal role, because, as I mentioned, by definition they are considered to be weaker than men. Nonetheless, it is not a subservient role, because they are placed into the same category as men. So that a skill set that a man may have and then use or mobilize in order to be part of this ruling class, that also then applies to the female body. This is a very striking observation, I think, for two reasons. The first is, of course, it goes against the entire existing understanding of the age. And indeed, at one point in his discussion, Socrates asks, who has got it right? Either we, in constructing our ideal city, are correct, that the female body, in fact, can take on the tasks that the male body can, that the distinctions between female and male are merely conventional, or everybody else has got it wrong, or, in fact, we're doing something very silly here. He himself is aware, he's cognizant of the enormous difference between this treatment of women in the context of the Republic and the sort of general, wider social treatment of women in ancient Greek society, and asks then, which is right, which is wrong? If we are correct, in other words, if it is true that the women of our ideal city can take on the role of guardians, what it suggests then is that the current subjection or subjugation or subservience of the female body in ancient Greek society is incorrect, is wrong, is not based on a sustainable presence. That's the first point, I think, that's there. And the second point, and it links to the first, is this then engages in this profound transformation because it moves women from a private family role into a public state role. So it makes of the female a public figure, a public citizen, a public entity, which again is overturning the entire sort of ancient Greek social understanding in which the female body is, by almost definition, has to be a private body, has to be embedded inside the family. The fact then that he does this, that he elevates women up to this sort of level of men in terms of their capacity to act in the guardian class, then I think leads to the second very jarring part of the Republic, which is the way that he subsequently deconstructs in very violent terms the family. And you may remember that he ends up in some places that we would consider to be extremely dangerous and probably forms of child abuse. So for instance, he argues that, and the reason he does this is related to the kind of communism that we'll come to in a moment, but he argues that the children of the guardian class should not be raised by their parents, but should be raised in a communal setting. And so therefore, at the moment, or very shortly after birth, so in this kind of postpartum period, that the bond between the mother or the parents and the child should be ruptured and should be reconstructed or remade in a communal sense. And so instead of having an individual relation between the parent and the child, that relation is then recast as a communal relationship between the community of guardians and the children that they produce. Now, to our modern ears, the idea of snatching children away from their parents and putting them into some kind of collective daycare system, the purpose of which is essentially to destroy the sort of biological parental authority, strikes us as very bizarre indeed. Why is it then that Socrates underlines this as a necessity for the guardian class? I think the straightforward answer is it puts the emphasis on de-individualization. So from the very moment that you are born into this kind of class where you are destined to take on this special position, that the very nature of your upbringing emphasizes not you as an individual, but you as a component of a community. And insofar then as a specific relationship with a specific person as your mother or your father reinforces an individual identity, so it stands to reason that if you rupture that and move people into a kind of communal nurturing environment, that sense of individuality is recast, and it's recast through then the logic of that community. And the purpose then of this kind of communal upbringing is it ruptures that sense of identity. Your heritage is not an individual heritage. You are not the child of certain specific parents. You're the child of this community of people. And so your individuality is now subsumed within that community and is subordinated to what that community represents. So it's, in that sense, it de-individualizes the self. If you were to ask who you are, you wouldn't be able to say, I am so-and-so, son of or daughter of such and such. Now you would only be able to define yourself in terms of the community in which you were raised. Yeah?
I'm a little bit confused because I feel like this contradicts the social mobility part.
I think that what you're sort of getting at is that, in general, it suggests that the children of guardians will then be the new guardians. And I think that is correct. I think that's, certainly it's clear, and we'll see in a moment, that Plato argues that genetic characteristics are transmitted from parents to children. But it doesn't necessarily invalidate, if you will, the terms of the lie that have been presented, which is you are not destined to have all of your children simply repeat the class into which you have found yourself. So the first premise then is that that raising the child in a communal setting, all I wanted to get at was the fact that it leads to this kind of de-individualization by separating the identity of the individual from the heritage that they can claim. You can't claim a heritage if you have no sense of where you come from, right? Or you have to relocate that heritage into a communal sense. Insofar as the community of guardians, what's the job of the guardians? To defend the city, to rule over the city, or to serve as the class of people from whom the rulers are chosen. Essentially what it does is it relocates the heritage of the child into a heritage that is then indelibly linked to that of the well-being of the city, because that is what that class of people does. Why do we have this system in place? What's going on here? The reason it's the guardians is because of the special role that they have. The guardians represent the expression of those virtues. Remember, we talked about arete as the virtues that we have. The expression of those virtues that are the best that we have, the best in people. And so those who have it in the best to the highest degree are those in whom we want to place our trust. And so therefore, we select for people in order to cultivate those traits. In a way, it all interlocks, because if you've handed to your ruling power, if you've handed to the ruling authority the capacity to lie to you, the capacity to shape what you hear, the reality in which you live, and also give them the power to be responsible for your defense, you're going to have a stake in making sure that those people are the best possible people they can be, because of the power that they have in keeping the city, as he calls it, a healthy city. And so therefore, you're going to want to select for these traits, and you're going to make sure that when you have those traits, that they emerge in the best possible way. So you want to de-emphasize the things that might work against them, like, for example, individual greed, individual concern, and emphasize instead the elements that serve the sort of social interest best, which is concern for community outside or beyond concern for the self. And this, I think, then leads to this sort of what we might call the communism. Again, it's a much debated, much discussed idea. And you'll see this at 416d, 417a, in which he makes the point that the guardian class will be exempted from, or will, let's say, we might say prohibited from, the ownership of private property. So one of the things that happens when you're part of the guardian class is that you become what we might call today wards of the state. You are essentially taken care of by the state. You don't own your own house. You don't own your own goods. That all of that you have is provided for you. Where you live is essentially an open public space. So you live a kind of fully public life. You don't have a kind of private life. So in a sense, this principle of the guardian as reliant on the state, as sort of taking on this what we might call radically public role, we can then go back and think about this issue of child rearing and family and so on, that essentially it's simply extending that principle at the level of reproduction. It's simply saying that children then are part of this radical public role of the guardians. And even the children are separated from anything that might create a sense of ownership or individuality, and instead are radically communalized. Because if you are the child of certain parents, that creates, if you will, a kind of, in an emotional bonding way, similar kinds of relationship as ownership to something might create, something that you feel responsible for, that you will protect more than others. Whereas the idea here is you want to ensure that the guardians are always acting in a kind of communal interest, not a self-interest. And so this is where this comes from. So Beltran's point about eugenics, this is another very uncomfortable feature of the Republic to many modern readers, because as part of this program of making sure that the leadership of the city is placed in the best possible hands, you want to make sure you produce the best possible people. Where do people come from? They come from the copulation between a male and a female. Therefore, if you want to get the best possible people, you want to ensure that the best possible females copulate with the best possible males, thereby producing the best possible offspring. And we call that eugenics. What we really call it is animal husbandry, but we don't like thinking of ourselves as animals, so therefore we have a separate name reflecting human egotism or egoism. So when it's animals, it's animal husbandry. When it's people, we call it eugenics, and the idea is essentially it's a form of selective breeding. We select who gets to breed with whom. The idea is that you try to bring the best of each together in order to maximize the chances that the children then will represent the virtues of the parents to the highest possible degree. So this eugenics program links then to the idea of this kind of communal upraising. Part of what he wants to do is, by separating the relationship between parents and children, I believe as part of it is that men are allowed to go out and breed as much as they possibly can. So it even creates doubt about parentage, right? You're not even sure who the father is, because the male guardians are encouraged to copulate as widely as possible with a sort of select population of suitable females. So this eugenics program links then to this larger program of essentially ensuring that the guardian class maintains or even enhances this set of virtues, which are then seen as fundamentally necessary to the effective stewardship of the city. It all sounds a bit ridiculous to modern ears, but if we depart from the principle that if we have not a city of pigs, but a luxurious city where we are working not only to keep ourselves alive from one day to the next, but to enhance the quality of our lives through the generation of surplus goods, and that therefore we will need to defend those surplus goods and recognize that only some are capable of defending us, everything sort of follows from there. And it all becomes a matter not of individual self-interest, but collective or communal self-interest. The sort of health, the safety, the well-being of the community becomes reliant on the capacity essentially to construct this system of authority, this system of rule. Yeah?
Yeah, but what's the point of having a luxurious city and a city with a lot of material goods if the leading class, the class of the guys, has no private property?
Well, everybody else has private property. There's a small group of people who are, if you will, who enter into this kind of communal existence, but 90% of the population has nice houses and cars and all the rest of it.
The really important ones are the ones that are missing all the time.
But we're putting that's a modern sense of importance. It's linking, if you will, material wealth to importance. But remember, what's the concern of the book? Justice. And remember, what is Socrates trying to do? He's trying to argue that justice is not something that feels bad now but brings rewards later because you get a reputation for being a nice guy. Justice is something that feels good now and feels good later. Therefore, it follows that the happiest person, the person who is most capable of achieving, and we saw this last time, this idea of good spirits, human flourishing, eudaimonia, are those who are most capable of inculcating justice inside of them. So in a way, it's a different reading of human prosperity, right? It's not a material reading of human prosperity. It's an immaterial reading of human prosperity, underlined by the fact that that the powerful class, if you will, the class of rulers, in some ways have the least material possessions, have the least prosperity, in some ways have the least power insofar as we link power to material goods, but have the highest capacity to cultivate this sense of justice, and that's why they take on the role that they do. And don't forget that the fundamental principle of the philosopher king rules not because they are greedy for power. Why does the philosopher king rule? Because they know that if somebody else rules, they won't do as good a job. And so they are reluctant rulers, right? It's the principle of reluctant rule. Not people who are seeking out glory, but people who must accept this position because of their knowledge that if they don't, others worse than them may indeed take that position. Yeah?
But under those conditions, who would actually be happy to be a guardian and practice justice every day?
Well, I mean, I get you. I mean, look, you can do your own accounting. I mean, on the one hand, apparently you get to have sex as much as you want with as many people as you want, and no one cares. On the other hand, your children are immediately stripped away from you and placed into a kind of communal daycare. So, I don't know. Benefits on both sides? You'd have to do your own reckoning. Presumably for Plato, he would not locate it in a kind of material, physical gratification, but the idea that if you have the kind of soul, and remember we talked about this, we'll come back to it in a moment, if you have the kind of soul that has these qualities, it's that you will recognize that these are the kinds of things that you should do, right? Because ultimately this allows you to reach what is the best inside of you. One of the things that comes out of that, you may recall, if you can think back to last week where our conversation began, Socrates and his friends went down to the Piraeus, and remember this whole journey is about getting back to Athens with this sort of new understanding of justice. And they run into the old man Cephalus, and remember they have some drinks in his garden. And what does Cephalus define justice as? Cephalus says it's good to be wealthy when you're old. Why? Because he says you worry about all the things you've done in your life. Justice is paying back what you owe. Remember that sense of, right, making wrongs right again, we might say it, right? Paying your debts. This is how Cephalus says you can die in peace, make yourself feel that you are at peace with the gods, and therefore prepare to shrug off your mortal life. So the Cephalus definition of justice is then not only rooted in, but emphasizes material prosperity. If you don't have the money to pay off your debts, you will die a troubled soul. You'll die a troubled individual. In some ways, this emphasis in the Guardians on a kind of non-material conditions serves as a refutation of that initial premise that was launched by Cephalus. Because what it suggests instead is that rather than look for some sort of sense of human prosperity, human flourishing, eudaimonia, in the acquisition of material goods, instead we need to dematerialize it. We need to locate it somewhere else. And so as we saw last class, we mentioned it very briefly and we'll come back to it, what Socrates argues is, as the city, so the individual, what matters then is that the elements of your, what we would call your psychic individuality, your soul, your psychological makeup, are in equilibrium, are in balance with one another. And so the degree to which the elements of your soul are balanced is the degree to which you are capable of exercising justice. And remember that the degree to which you are just is the degree to which you are happy. And so therefore the perfectly balanced soul is the perfectly happy individual in that sense. So let's take a look at what he says. It's at 443D and E. He says, the truth is that although justice apparently was something of this kind, it was not concerned with the external, or you might say material, performance of a man's own function, but with the internal performance of it. With his true self and his own true function, forbidding each of the elements within him to perform tasks other than its own, and not allowing the classes of things within his soul to interfere with one another. He has quite literally to put his own house in order, being himself his own ruler, his own mentor, and his own friend, and tuning the three elements just like three fixed points in a musical scale. Do you remember what the three elements of the soul were? Logos, reason, tumos, appetite, and eros, emotional desire. And so these three elements, the things we want, the things we desire, the things we have an appetite for, the reason that we use to control all of them, it's the balance of those three that then defines the kind of life that we can live, because that defines the kind of individual that we are. And if there turn out to be intervening elements, he must combine them all and emerge as a perfect unity of these diverse elements. That's the goal for us as human beings. The most just human being is the person who has the perfect unity of their appetites, of their desires, and of their reason, of their tumos, of their eros, and of their logos. And so in a sense, there's this equivalence that's drawn. You may recall that in the state, we have these three classes of people. There's this constant sense of division. And where you have a sense of division, then you need to be thinking about equilibrium, right? How do I create the perfect equilibrium? Part of the reason why the guardians are treated in this special way is they serve as the equilibrating function inside the society. And that's why their care, their nurture, their selection, indeed even their physical production is so important, because of this role that they play. And so essentially it's a way of making, or it's a kind of consequence of the metaphor that Socrates has constructed. If we construct as a thought experiment a city to explore the question of justice, if we then define justice not as some external action, but instead as an internal state, therefore the city, in order for the city to be just, needs to reflect that. It's not what the city does, it is how the city is constituted that then reflects this idea of justice. And the guardianship, if you will, of the city becomes critical to that. And so this reading of justice as equilibrium of these competing elements within us, I think helps to explain some of the features of the city that we see.